On the day before Christmas Eve 1991, a man ran out of a burning house in Corsicana, Texas, and collapsed in the front yard, screaming that his 3 little girls were still inside. Neighbors had to hold him back from the flames. 12 years later, the state of Texas strapped that same man to a gurney and killed him for setting that fire, for murdering his own children. And then, after he was already dead, a scientist the state itself had hired read the evidence one more time and reached a conclusion no one could take back, that there had probably never been a crime at all. His name was Cameron Todd Willingham. He was 23 years old when his daughters died, and he would spend the last 12 years of his life insisting he had tried to save them. His town didn't believe him. The jury didn't believe him. The governor didn't believe him. Everyone who mattered was certain, and the science that made them certain would, one careful reading at a time, come completely apart. Just never in time. Hold on to that gap between the truth and the timing, because everything that is unbearable about this story lives inside it. Start with the fire, because everyone else did. It was the morning of December 23, 1991. Todd Willingham was asleep in the little frame house on West 11th Street when his 2-year-old daughter Amber woke him. The house was filling with smoke. His wife Stacy was out. She'd gone to pick up Christmas presents. So it was just Todd at home with Amber and her 1-year-old twin sisters, Carmon and Cameron. What happened in the next few minutes would be dissected, frame by frame, for the rest of his life and beyond it. He got out. His daughters did not. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the house was roaring, and Todd was in the yard, burned in places, his hair singed, screaming for someone to save his babies. Neighbors described a man out of his mind. And here is where the story quietly forks, because some of those same neighbors, and soon the investigators, began to describe something else. That he seemed too calm at moments. That at one point he was worried about moving his car so it wouldn't catch fire. Small things. Human things maybe. Shock does strange things to people. But once a suspicion takes hold, every ordinary detail starts to look like evidence. And a suspicion did take hold. Fast, Durham. Because when the fire was out and the investigators walked through the blackened shell of the house, they believed they could read the fire like a language. And they believed it was telling them that this fire had been set on purpose. Hold that thought, because that language is the hinge this entire case turns on. And 30 years later, it would be exposed as something closer to superstition. But in 1991 in Corsicana, it was gospel. Now the town went looking for the kind of man who could do such a thing. And Todd Willingham was an easy man to make into a monster. He was a high school dropout with a temper and a record of trouble. He drank. There were allegations he'd been rough with Stacy. On his walls hung heavy metal posters. Iron Maiden, Led Zeppelin, skulls and imagery that, to a frightened community in the grip of a satanic panic era, looked like proof of something evil. He had tattoos of a skull and a serpent. None of that is a crime. None of that lights a fire. But stacked together and lit by grief and rage, it built a picture, and the picture was, this is not a victim. This is a killer who murdered his own children and then stood in the yard and performed the part of the heartbroken father. Even the grief was turned against him. At the girl's funeral, some mourners watched him and decided they were seeing a performance. A refrigerator in the kitchen had come to rest near a doorway, and investigators decided he had shoved it there to block his children's escape, though there was an ordinary explanation for where it stood. Stacy, for a time, stood by her husband and said she believed he was innocent. None of it slowed the machine down. In a town this size, bearing 3 babies 3 days before Christmas, people did not want a tragic accident. They wanted someone to hate. And Todd Willingham, with his record, his temper, and his skulls on the wall, was standing right there. That was the story the town told. That was the story the state would tell a jury. And once you've decided a man is a monster, you stop asking whether the science that convicts him is any good. You just reach for it and you use it. So let's look at the science, because that is where this stops being one man's tragedy and becomes something that should frighten every single one of us. The case against Cameron Todd Willingham rested on 2 pillars. The first was fire. The lead investigators were a Texas deputy state fire marshal named Manuel Vasquez and a Corsicana assistant fire chief named Douglas Fogg. They walked the ruins, and they came out with a long list. Roughly 20 separate indicators, they said, that pointed to arson. To a jury, 20 of anything sounds overwhelming. So let me give you the ones that did the damage, because you need to see how convincing they sounded, and then how completely they would fall. They pointed to burn patterns on the floor, dark, puddle-shaped scorches that they said could only be the footprints of a liquid accelerant, poured out and set alight. They called them pore patterns. They pointed to crazed glass, a spiderweb of tiny cracks in the windows, which they testified was the signature of a fire that had grown unnaturally hot and fast. The kind of heat you only get when someone helps it along. They pointed to multiple, separate points where the fire seemed to have started, as if someone had lit it in several places at once. They pointed to burning low, along the floor and under the front door's threshold, where an honest accidental fire, they said, would not go. And they found a trace of accelerant near the front doorway. Put it together the way the prosecution did, and it was damning. A man pours a trail of liquid fire through his own house, lights it in several places, and walks out while his children burn. Vasquez was blunt about it on the stand. The fire, he testified, told him the story, and the story was murder. Then came the second pillar, a man named Johnny Webb. Webb was in the Navarro County Jail on his own charges when he came forward to say that Willingham had confessed to him, that Todd had admitted setting the fire and had said something monstrous about the children to cover it up. A jailhouse informant is one of the most powerful things you can put in front of a jury, and historically one of the most dangerous. Because informants often want something, a reduced sentence, a favor, a way out, and juries rarely get to weigh how much that wanting shapes the words. What the jury in 1992 did not fully see was how much Johnny Webb had to gain. Keep Webb in the back of your mind, because his story does not stay put. Years later, it would twist and recant, and twist again. And what it revealed about how this case was built would be its own kind of scandal. There was one more fact the jury never got to weigh, and it may be the most human detail in the entire record. Before trial, prosecutors offered Cameron Todd Willingham a deal. Plead guilty, and instead of death, you get life. Take the plea and you live. He said no. A guilty man, staring down a needle, is handed a way to keep breathing, and he refuses it, because to take it, he would have to say he killed his daughters. He would not say it. He turned down his own life to avoid confessing to a crime he insisted he did not commit. Sit with how strange that is if he was truly the monster the state described. There was one more voice at that trial, and it may be the most chilling, not for what it proved, but for what it was allowed to claim. To send a man to death row in Texas, a jury has to decide he will be dangerous in the future. So the state called a psychiatrist who told the jury that Cameron Todd Willingham was a deep, remorseless sociopath, the kind of man who would kill again the moment he got the chance. And as proof of that darkness inside him, the prosecution again pointed to the heavy metal posters and the skull tattoo. It was a confident, scientific-sounding verdict on the contents of a man's soul, delivered by a psychiatrist so notorious for exactly this brand of courtroom prophecy that his own profession would later expel him for it. One junk science said the fire was murder. A second junk science said the man was born to kill. Between the two of them, they built a death sentence. It didn't matter. In August of 1992, the jury took very little time. They convicted him of capital murder, and they sentenced him to death. The fire had spoken, an informant had sworn, and a monster had been named. Cameron Todd Willingham was sent to death row to wait for the state to kill him. And for a while, that is exactly where the story looked like it would end. A closed case, a guilty man, justice apparently done. Except one person on the outside couldn't let it go, and what she found would turn the fire science of this case and then the entire system behind it, inside out. Her name was Elizabeth Gilbert. She was a playwright, not an investigator, and she started writing to death row prisoners almost by accident. One of them was Todd Willingham. She expected a monster. What she found over months of letters and visits was a man who talked about his kids, who didn't add up to the story on paper. So she started digging, pulling records, tracking down witnesses, asking the questions no one had bothered to ask once the town had decided who he was. And the deeper she went, the more the case felt less like a solved murder and more like a house built on sand. She was not a lawyer or a detective. She had no client, no career riding on the answer, nothing to win. That is part of what makes what she found so damning. It took an outsider with nothing to gain to notice that the emperor of this case was wearing no clothes at all. She couldn't crack the fire science herself. So, as the execution date closed in, the case reached a man who could, a chemist named Gerald Hurst. Hurst was not a soft touch. He was a Cambridge-trained scientist, a genuine expert in fire and explosives. And he had a reputation for going where the evidence went, no matter whose side that helped. He took the file, and he did the one thing no one had done. He tested every single indicator against what modern fire science actually knew. And what he found should have stopped the execution cold. Here is the reversal, the heart of this entire story, so let me make it plain. The pore patterns on the floor, the puddle-shaped burns the state swore could only come from poured accelerant. By the 1990s, scientists understood a phenomenon called flashover. In a closed room, a fire fills the space with superheated gas near the ceiling until the whole room reaches a temperature where everything ignites at once. Floor, furniture, walls, all of it. After a flashover, the fire itself scorches the floor in exactly the pooled, irregular patterns that old investigators had spent decades calling proof of arson. The pore patterns weren't evidence of a poured liquid. They were the fingerprints of an ordinary fire that had gotten big enough. The crazed glass, the spiderweb cracks that supposedly proved unnatural heat. Scientists had shown that crazing isn't caused by fast heat at all. It's caused by cold water hitting hot glass, which is to say it's caused by firefighters spraying their hoses. The very act of putting the fire out created the evidence that a fire had been set. The multiple points of origin, the low burning, the char under the threshold, one by one, flashover and normal fire behavior explained them. Even the trace of accelerant by the front door had an innocent answer. There was a small grill and lighter fluid on that porch. Every pillar of the fire case, the entire 20-indicator tower that had sent a man to death row, was built on folklore that real science had already left behind. Hurst's conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. There was no valid evidence that this fire was arson at all. It looked for all the world like an accident. Think about what that means. If the fire wasn't arson, then no one murdered those 3 little girls. There was no killer in that house. There was only a father who couldn't reach his children in time, which is exactly what he had said, screaming in the yard from the very first minute. Hurst wrote it up, and in the days before the execution, his report was sent to the people with the power to stop it. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and the Office of the Governor, Rick Perry. A working scientist was telling the state of Texas, in writing, before it was too late, the science you used to condemn this man is wrong. And the state of Texas killed him anyway. There was no stay. Clemency was denied. On February 17, 2004, Cameron Todd Willingham was put to death by lethal injection in the Huntsville unit. He went to his death the same way he had lived the last 12 years of his life, insisting he was innocent. He was 36 years old, and it was not for lack of chances to stop it. His appeals had climbed through the courts for years, and by the end, the Hurst report was sitting right there in the record, a working scientist's plain warning that the fire evidence was worthless. Court after court let the execution stand anyway. Some never squarely wrestled with the new science. Others simply had no more patience for a man already stamped guilty. The system had a dozen doors marked exit, and it walked past every one of them. Whatever else is uncertain in this case, this is not. The warning arrived in time from a qualified scientist, and the machinery of the state rolled forward over it without slowing down. Now, if the story ended there, you could call it a tragedy and look away. A last-minute report brushed aside in the rush of an execution. Terrible, but arguable. The reason this case will not let anyone look away is what happened next. Because after Todd Willingham was dead and buried, the state of Texas accidentally proved him right. Texas had created something called the Forensic Science Commission, a body meant to investigate exactly this kind of question. Was the science reliable? The commission took up the Willingham case, and it hired one of the country's leading fire scientists, a man named Craig Baylor, to review the original investigation from top to bottom. Baylor's report landed in 2009, and it was not gentle. He found that the arson finding could not be supported by the evidence, that in his words, a finding of arson could not be sustained. And then he went further and aimed a sentence directly at the methods that had convicted Willingham. The fire marshal's testimony, Baylor wrote, was hardly consistent with a scientific mindset and is more characteristic of mystics or psychics. A state-commissioned expert had just described the evidence that killed a man as closer to fortune-telling than to science. That should have been a reckoning. Instead, it became a cover-up in slow motion. Just 2 days before the commission was scheduled to meet and discuss Baylor's findings, Governor Perry replaced 3 of its members, including its chairman, Sam Bassett. His new appointee took over as chair and canceled the meeting. The review that might have officially branded a Texas execution as a mistake was stopped before it could speak. Perry, who was running for re-election, denied interfering and publicly stuck to the town's original verdict. Willingham, he said, was a monster. But the science would not be unsaid. The Innocence Project brought in 5 of the nation's top fire experts to look at the case independently. Their report ran 48 pages, and its conclusion left no room to hide. None of the scientific analysis used to convict Mr. Willingham was valid. Not weak, not outdated, not valid. 0 of it. And the second pillar, the informant, was crumbling too. Johnny Webb, the man who'd sworn Willingham confessed in jail, took his story back, and it came out that he had gotten favorable treatment for his testimony. His account had wobbled for years, recanted, then partly walked back. But the pattern underneath it was clear enough. The confession that helped seal a death sentence rested on a witness who wanted something and got it. The charge Webb had been facing was quietly reduced after he testified. Part of a man's death sentence, it turned out, had been traded for another man's lighter one. So look at what was left. The fire, not arson. The confession from an informant who was compensated and later recanted. 2 pillars both fallen after the execution, not before. Here is where an honest story has to slow down and tell you the truth about the truth. Cameron Todd Willingham has never been exonerated. No court has thrown out his conviction. There is no official document anywhere that says the state of Texas executed an innocent man. His ex-wife, Stacy, at one point said she believed he was guilty. The case is, to this day, formally contested, and the people who prosecuted him have never conceded they were wrong. If you came here wanting a clean verdict, a moment where a judge bangs a gavel and declares him innocent, it does not exist, and I won't invent it for you. But that is not the same as not knowing. What we know is this: the fire science that convicted him has been examined by some of the best fire scientists in the world, before his death and after it, and they agree. The pour patterns, the crazed glass, the points of origin, the whole 20-item case, invalid. A state-commissioned expert compared it to the work of psychics. 5 independent experts said none of it held. The single most likely explanation for what happened in that house on West 11th Street is not murder. It's an accidental fire, and a father who couldn't get to his kids. There is a name for what nearly everyone who has studied the evidence now believes happened in that house, and it is the most ordinary phrase in the world: a house fire. A space heater, faulty wiring, a small child with a match. No one ever had to prove which, because for a fire in a wood frame house full of little kids, the honest default is not murder. It's an accident until real evidence says otherwise. And real evidence never did. Which means the real horror of this case isn't that the system got a hard call wrong. It's that the system was warned in writing by a qualified scientist while there was still time, and it killed him anyway. And then, when the proof kept coming, it looked away, reassigned the people asking the questions, and called the dead man a monster so it would never have to call him a victim. We built a machine powerful enough to end a human life, and we fed it evidence that turned out to be folklore. The tragedy of Cameron Todd Willingham is not only that he may have died for a crime that was never committed, it's that everything we needed to know, we could have known in time, and we chose the certainty of a monster over the doubt of a grieving father. He said it from the first minute in the yard to the last minute on the gurney. He did not do this. The science we have now says he may well have been telling the truth the entire time. Texas just couldn't hear it until the man was already gone. If you think a warning from a scientist should be enough to stop an execution before it happens, not 5 years too late, hit like so the next person who reads a fire learns to read it right.